I've played a bunch of different miHoYo games, from Genshin to HSR, alongside ZZZ, and then even externally speaking, other games like Aether Gazer, Punishing Grey Raven, Wuthering Waves, Nikke, Blue Archive, and a few more. And I can comfortably say, pulling for a DPS in any miHoYo game is absolutely awful. And honestly speaking, within that first year of the game, I think it's one of the worst decisions you can make. Strictly because miHoYoverse doesn't have an idea or even a rough concept of how to properly build an endgame that considers the mechanics and overall knowledge you have of the game engaging. And instead, their variation of making a new character appealing or any interesting thing for endgame is A, beef up the damage they do in the HP pool, and B, make the newest character the strongest by giving them something no other character has. Now, obviously, we're filling out the roster in ZZZ, which is why characters like Caesar exist for the defense archetype, though she's entirely different from the likes of Seth. I understand that Seth is a 4-star, but still, Caesar is doing a little bit too much as a defensive character who offers buffs better than Lucy and offers stun that's on par with certain stunners. And then the likes of Bernice and Lighter and future characters doing more. And the fact that, as we've seen right now, 1.0 characters are going to forever be stuck with this weird core passive that requires them to have either a faction sharing character in their squad or the same elements within their squad. Physical for Nekomata, for example. But beyond that, if we're looking at other characters, you have characters like Qingyi, who legitimately just want a character who has or is of the attack type, which is something you're very likely to do unless you're running an anomaly DPS. Or perhaps you're pulling for somebody like Caesar, who just wants anyone who can activate a defensive assist, which, keep in mind, everybody has a defensive assist. It's in their base kit. It's like saying anybody who can attack. Just get rid of it at that point. I don't understand, but that's an entirely different scenario, an entirely different circumstance. Today, I want to discuss the fact that no matter who you pick, whether they're a standard character or a launch limited, or even a limited that was added future, like maybe 1.2 or 1.3 or whatever, let's be honest here, they're gonna get power creep. Who doesn't understand how to design an interesting character that doesn't just immediately power creep the last? I like playing Nekomata. She's my favorite character, and the only limited I pulled has been Qingyi. Whilst I picked up a Seth, I'm deliberately avoiding pulling on any banner strictly because none of the character designs interest me, and subsequently, I don't need them. But I also understand that Nekomata isn't going to be good for a pretty long while. I'd say even now, she's very, very heavily being pushed out, specifically because we don't have any physical 4-stars that are actually really good, that aren't DPSs, because Piper's a DPS basically, so is Corrin, and so is Billy. But that's a story for another time, because miHoYo is really bad at designing characters. I like this game. I want you to keep that in mind. I like this game, but I've played enough miHoYo games to know that they don't do DPSs or endgame concepts very well. I want you to keep in mind that yes, 1.0 characters and characters from launch will still be decent long, but they won't be exceptional. And in regards to DPSs, because their entire value is basically judged by how much damage they deal, the moment another DPS comes out that does better than them, they are immediately lowered down. Especially considering miHoYoverse doesn't actively try to pursue the concept of making engaging endgame and instead makes enemies damage sponges that hit extremely hard. Their variation of endgame is if you don't have a character who deals X amount of damage, you are not going to clear it. Rather than you learning the mechanics of the characters or the mechanics of the gameplay or the mechanics of the enemies, that doesn't matter. And so as much as I could say for other games that yeah, you can learn the boss mechanics, you can learn their weaknesses, you can learn when you can and should attack, miHoYoverse makes it very obvious with stun window, debuff duration, and with certain sets requiring, or certain core passives for instance, requiring actions to be done, like assault. They make it very obvious when your DPS window is. And so as a result, you can only get so far if you learn the character, and especially if you learn the content and the enemy, because instead of adapting the enemies to be either fast or more challenging, or maybe have a shield or something, or even a weak spot that you have to target specifically, they instead design it around the concept of, hey, this enemy hits hard, you just have to hit hard. Or this enemy has an elemental shield. Do you have that elemental shield? No? Well, you're not clearing. Taking a look at their other respective property, Honkai Star Rail, miHoYoverse kind of follows a similar suit. 1.0 characters like Yanqing were actually quite fine early in the game because he was very easy to build. This was followed up with characters like Sealy, who actually worked quite well. She had high speed by her base stat, and then subsequently got more speed with her E2, and then her entire mechanic was around a resurgence. So how did she get pushed out? Well, first off, you have to kill the enemy to proc resurgence, and second off, they started doing AoE. Anby the Lunai, Blade, and then Jingliu. Jingliu being a character who, despite having relatively similar archetypes as the previous two characters, built herself an immense amount of crit. And so crit became undervalued because she didn't need it. She already had a ton in her base kit, which is how we got to the point of, hey, a bunch of characters either come with a bunch of attack percentage loaded in the kit, a bunch of crit loaded in the kit or the constellations, or do something that nobody else does. The unique mechanics of, hey, maybe proccing elemental weaknesses. If we're looking at, for example, Anby the Lunai here, a character who's actually quite fine, his entire, or at least a big bonus of his kit was if the enemy's imaginary weak. Now, at the time, we had nobody who implanted imaginary weakness. You could theoretically rely on a Silver Wolf in an imaginary oriented team and hope that she applies the imaginary weakness, but that wasn't a guarantee and she wasn't AoE. So in the end of the day, it made sense to pull a quantum DPS, pull an imaginary DPS, a lightning DPS, and so on, just to match the elements you would be facing potentially. And that's where you had staples, like Clara. But then it got to the point of, well, instead of just having Silver Wolf implant her weakness, what if we gave it to every new character? Or what if he gave it to characters just so they could ignore a weakness archetype? And that's where we're at now with Acheron and characters like Fei Zhao. Not only do they implant the weakness in Fei Zhao in Firefly's case, but subsequently they also ignore weakness types. And as a result of these very flexible characters, the early on characters don't carry any weight anymore because, well, Sealy is single target. Single target's bad. DOT, despite being really good for a long term, is just bad now. Jing Yuan lost favor because, yeah, he was good when, Blade was top tier, and when Sealy was top tier because he had AoE, but follow-ups have basically eclipsed him with the likes of Yun Li and Clara, who are much more consistent. Your top tier damagers like Liu aren't nearly as good as characters like Acheron, because not only can Acheron make better use of crit buffers, like Sparkle for example, or attack skillers, but subsequently, her teams are more flexible. Why? Because Liu doesn't have consistent buffers, Firefly desperately wants Ron Mei, and Acheron already has a really good pre-existing team with Mono Quantum. And so, your first DPS, and your second, and your third, and your fourth, and then your fifth are all pushed out of the meta in favor of a new archetype that entirely ignores the concepts we already had previously built up. Your Yanqing, your Sealy, and none of these individuals are going to compare to the likes of Acheron, Firefly, and Fei Zhao. Why? Because not only do they ignore weakness type or subsequently add their weakness, but they also have immense amounts of buffs within their kit, and subsequently also have high multipliers. Acheron, for example, has really good multipliers. Sealy could have great multipliers, but she's subsequently still limited by the concept of being single target, which doesn't fly in today's meta. And so for ZZZ, you run into a scenario where, hey, Nekomata, Zhuyan, Ellen can all, in theory, use the same buffs, crit, attack percentage, and so on. Lucy can give crit and some crit damage and attack percentage, I suppose. Qingyi can give a flat damage percentage bonus. But if a character comes out who just outright does better, whether that be with a bunch of anomaly damage that you can't really compare to in Genshin, for instance, that's just Dendro damage as a whole, because Dendro has so many great reactions that most DPSs can't keep up, or a character that in theory gives himself so many crit buffs, an example being Zhuan's 30% crit additional bonus. That's nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not nearly on par with characters like Jing Liu. That's just as an example in this game thus far. Basically, the TLDR is, new characters are going to come out with kits that are vastly superior to older characters. And in theory, the easiest way to tell how good a character is go to the EX skill, the ultimate, or the core passive. How many words do you see? If it doesn't fill up and if it doesn't look like a thesaurus and a dictionary, it's not good enough. Now, look at that. That's simple. That's short. That's too short. Look at Qingyi. We're getting better, but we're not quite there yet. Look at Caesar. Oh, we're getting there. We're getting here. This is a lot of words, but not enough. They can do more. They can do a lot more. And so basically, in Genshin as of right now, the older characters Hu Tao, Ganyu, Diluc, for example, Klee, Raiden, and Shogun, these aren't nearly as good as the likes of New Valette. For the overall, just unnecessary amounts of self-sustaining he has alongside high damage, or the likes of just Dendro as a whole. So if you're looking for longevity within your account, pull for support. I'm not even saying pull for Qingyi, because Qingyi is likely not going to be a great support long term because she's so early. That's like pulling for Venti. Let's be honest here, how many of you in Genshin still use Venti? We've seen the likes of characters like Fu Xuan fall off as we get more and more into AoE-oriented content in HSR. Bronya is dead in the water for a vast majority of you. Silverwolf is still limited by her team archetypes, and in many cases you don't want to use her. And so once again, you fall into a similar situation of, hey, supports are good, yes, they really hold value long term, yes, but you may want to wait until you get someone who's absolutely busted. A lot of individuals can go for E6 Sparkle and basically ignore the concept of artifact farming. DCZ doesn't have that, strictly because we don't really have, any good buffers yet, other than the 4 stars at launch and a 5-star. So maybe wait for more. You can make a character good. You can build them as best you can. You can be the master at using them, but your damage will usually, unless they are C6, and in most cases, even if they are, always be far behind the best or the most recent character, because the most recent character has the most amount of individual instances of damage, the most amount of enhancements in their kit stuffed into him. You, as a character or as an individual who loves possibly Zhuyan, possibly Ellen Zhou, will not be able to match up to the likes of Miyabi in the future. Even Bernice, compared to the likes of somebody like Piper or Grace or even Jane Doe, will be entirely different. That sucks, because the question then becomes, why would I care about Endgame if the Endgame content is going to be so heavily geared towards the most recent characters? Because not even the bosses are geared towards them, it's the concept of the Abyss buffs are geared towards them, to the extent to where it becomes very difficult to clear with older units unless you have higher investment on them. And higher investment typically translates to Eidolons, Constellations, Cinemas, Weapons, and so on. But tell me your thoughts down below. This is a longer video. I didn't mean to ramble, but I'll see you next time. Hit subscribe.